Welcome to Jeremy's IT Lab. Hi from Tokyo, Japan, and welcome to Jeremy's IT Lab. In this section of our CCNA course, we'll cover the Spanning Tree Protocol Toolkit, a set of features that you can use to modify and enhance Spanning Tree. This first video starts with PortFast, a handy feature that lets a switch port skip the STP listening and learning state and immediately start forwarding data when it's connected. Here's what we'll cover. This video and the next few will cover the STP toolkit, starting with PortFast in this video, which allows switch ports connected to end hosts to immediately enter the STP forwarding state, bypassing listening and learning. This lets the hosts start communicating over the network as soon as they connect. No need to wait. Cisco expects you to know 4 other features in the STP toolkit as well: BPDU guard, BPDU filter, root guard, and loop guard. Feel free to read these descriptions if you want, but we'll cover them in the next few videos of the course. So let's get started with PortFast. First of all, what exactly is the problem that PortFast solves? Let's connect this PC and switch to find it. When an end host connects to a switch port like this, the port becomes up, can't send or receive data. By up, I mean the status of the port in show IP interface 3, as you can see here. The switch's G01 interface is up, but any frames the PC tries to send are discarded by the switch. And why is that? Well, it's an STP designated port, but will take a total of 30 seconds before it enters the forwarding state. That is, 15 seconds in the listening state and 15 seconds in the learning state. This leads to a poor user experience. The user expects to be able to access the network immediately, but for some reason it doesn't work. The user probably doesn't even know STP exists. They don't have any reason to know. They just know the internet doesn't work for 30 seconds when they connect their computer. And that's frustrating. And worst of all, this wait is totally unnecessary, because there is no risk of a layer 2 loop occurring between a switch and a PC. Loops can occur between switches because of how they flood through, but PCs don't do that. Let's check out the process on a real switch. Notice after I connect the cable into port 1 on this Cisco Catalyst switch, the link light above it turns on. Each port on a switch has a light like this, called a link light, to indicate its status. 2 blinking green lights on the bottom right indicate that those 2 ports are active and are sending and receiving data. But the link light for port 1, which I just connected to my PC, is blinking an amber color. This means the port is up and receiving data from my PC, but the data is blocked by STP. My PC can't access the network yet. Finally, after 30 seconds, the light turns green, meaning it is in the forwarding state and is ready to send and receive data. Now that we've seen the problem, let's see how PortFast solves it. Once again, I'll connect this PC to the switch. When PortFast is configured on a port, it immediately enters the forwarding state when connected to another device, when the port is enabled. So it bypasses listening and learning and can send and receive data right away without waiting 30 seconds. This obviously provides a much better user experience. The user's device can immediately access the network. Let's see PortFast in action on a real switch. This time I've enabled it on port 1 of my switch. So let's connect the cable. And as you can see, the link light turns green right away. The port is in the STP forwarding state and can send and receive data immediately. No more 30-second wait. So how can we configure PortFast? It's quite simple, but there are 2 ways to do it. The first is in interface config mode with the command spanning tree PortFast. This enables PortFast only on the individual interface, the interface you configure this command.
Put your hand on my shoulder. Baby. Do it in here so I can remember that setup.
But you can also enable it in global config mode.
Enable the port fast access interface that connected to in-host like pieces. For the spanning tree port fast, you will enable the port fast on the each interface you configure first.
With spanning tree port fast default. Instead of enabling port fast on an individual port, this enables port fast on all access. In most cases, this will enable port fast on all connections to end hosts, but not on connections to other switches. This is because connections between switches are almost always trunk ports, since most modern LANs use multiple. But connections to end hosts are almost always access, since most hosts don't need to send and receive traffic in multiple vehicles. As we'll cover in a minute, it's very important that you don't enable port fast, ports that connect to other switches. Let's try that first method in DCL. I entered interface config mode for G01 and used span tree port fast to enable port fast. When you enable port fast, you'll see this warning message. This is related to the point I just mentioned in the previous slide, so I'll read it. Port fast should only be enabled on ports connected to a single host. Connecting hubs, concentrators, switches, bridges, etc. to this interface when port fast is enabled can cause temporary bridging. Use with caution. Basically, this means that port fast should not be configured on ports connected to switches, or temporary loops can occur. The entire point of the listening and learning state is to make 100% sure there are no loops in the length before a port moves to the forwarding state. Because port fast bypassing makes the port start in the forwarding state, it can cause a temporary loop if you enable it on connections to other switches. So just remember that port fast shouldn't be enabled on ports that connect to other switches. Okay, in addition to that warning message, another message is shown here. Port fast has been configured on Gigabit Ethernet 01, but will only have effect when the interface is in a non-trunking mode. So even if you configure spanning tree port fast on a trunk port, it won't be active. By default, it only works on access ports. Okay, after configuring port fast on the port, I used show spanning tree interface G01 detail to confirm. Here's the command syntax. Show spanning tree interface, followed by the interface. Notice the line I highlighted. The port is in the port fast edge. This requires a bit of explanation. There are two kinds of port fast, edge and network. Port fast edge, and would have come from the video. Port fast network is used for a feature called bridge assurance. It's not a CCNA. I just wanted to clarify the edge in this. Next, let's try the second configuration, enabling port fast by default in global configuration. I've expanded the example network of edge. Switch 1 and switch 2. Let's try to clarify the meaning of edge in this. Next, let's try the second configuration, enabling port fast by default in global configuration. I've expanded the example network. Switch 1 and switch 2 are connected by the G00 and G01 trunks, and the G02 and 3 ports connected to both. They are finishing switch 1 0, but on both switches I configured spanning tree port fast. Just like before, a warning message appears. Let's read it. Warning, this command enables port fast by default on all interfaces. You should now disable port fast explicitly on switched ports leading to hubs, switches, and bridges, as they may create temporary bridging loops. Let me clarify the part I highlighted. It says all interfaces, but as I mentioned before, it only activates port fast on all access, not trunk ports. So this warning message is a bit misleading. Now, if you want to disable port fast on a specific access port after enabling it by default, you can use the command spanning tree port fast disable in interface config. You should do this if you connect two switches with an access, but that's rare. Connections between switches are usually trunked. Okay, here's that same show command I used before, looking at the output for switch 1's G02 interface, an access port. It says the port is in the port fast edge mode by default. So port fast has been enabled on these 4 ports, the access ports connected to end host. And what about the trunks connecting the switches? I used the same command for switch 1's G01 interface, and it doesn't mention port fast anywhere. So port fast isn't enabled on the trunk. The key point to remember here is that when you enable port fast in global config mode, it is only activated on access, not trunk port. We covered how to configure port fast on access ports. Now let's cover the topic of port fast on trunk ports, because there are some situations where it's valid. The standard port fast configuration command only enable port fast on access. Those are the commands we just covered. Spanning tree port fast in interface config mode, and spanning tree port fast default in global config. But in some cases, you might want to enable port fast on a trunk port. The network diagram above shows 2 examples. First is a port connected to a virtualization server with virtual machines, VMs, in different fields. Virtualization is a CCNA topic, but we'll cover it later in the course. For now, just know that servers using virtualization often use trunk links to connect to switches, instead of access links like most end hosts. And the second example is a port connected to a router via router on a stick. As we covered in the VLAN section of the course, router on a stick is basically a trunk link between a switch and a router. A router doesn't flood frames like a switch, and it won't cause layer 2 loop. So you can configure port fast on interfaces connected to a router like this. So how do we actually configure port fast on a trunk? It can only be configured per port in interface config. The command is spanning tree port fast. Let's see an example in the CLI. The command shows the same message we saw before, warning that port fast shouldn't be enabled on ports connected to switches. And here shows spanning tree interface detail. Only showing the relevant line since there's no switch. It says the port is in port fast edge trunk. In most CCNA scenarios, we will only need to enable port fast on access. But just keep in mind that it can also be enabled on trunk port. Finally, before we finish up, I want to briefly clarify port fast edge, which I mentioned earlier. To review, there are two port fast modes, port fast edge and port fast network. Port fast network isn't a CCNA topic, so we're covering port fast edge. In modern Cisco switches, if you use the commands covered in this lecture, the device will automatically add the edge keyword to the configuration. So, for example, if you configure spanning tree port fast on a port, in the running config, it will become spanning tree port fast edge. If you configure spanning tree port fast trunk, it will become spanning tree port fast edge trunk. And if you configure spanning tree port fast default, it will become spanning tree port fast edge default in the running config. You can use either version of the command when configuring port fast. It doesn't matter. The end result is the same. Edge will always be added in the configuration. As you probably guessed, if you want to configure port fast network instead of edge, you have to specify the network keyword in the command, like spanning tree port fast network. I also mentioned the command spanning tree port fast disable before, but just note that it doesn't use the edge keyword. It's an exception. Okay, let's verify the edge keyword in the CLI. I configured spanning tree port fast on switch 1's G01 interface. I then used show running config interface G01. This is a handy command. You can use it to view the running config for just the specified interface, instead of the device's entire running config. But unfortunately, it doesn't work in package. Anyway, here is the interface's config. Notice that the switch automatically added the edge keyword to the end of the command, even though I only configured spanning tree port fast.
Running code. Yes. Running code.
Okay, to summarize, just be aware that the type of port fast covered in the CCNA, the one we're talking about in this video, is called port fast edge. For the CCNA exam, you should probably be aware of both versions of these commands, with and without edge. Their effect is the same. But keep in mind that if you're doing labs in packet tracer, the current version doesn't support the edge keyword. So don't be confused if you try it in packet tracer and it doesn't work. Here's a summary of the main points covered in this video. When a host connects to a switch port, by default it takes 30 seconds before the port can send or receive data. And this can be frustrating for users who don't know why they can't connect.
For push give and to push switch this port become instead without waiting or very is in the user
Port fast allows a switch port to immediately enter the STP forwarding state, bypassing listening and learning. So the connected host can access the network right away, making a much better experience for the user. Port fast can be configured in two ways. The first is in interface config mode with the spanning tree port fast command, optionally with the edge keyword. This enables port fast only on the individual interface, and is only active when the interface is in access mode, not trunk mode. The second option is in global config mode with spanning tree port fast default, which enables port fast on all access ports. If necessary, you can then disable it on specific ports with spanning tree port fast disabled. Just remember that port fast should not be configured on ports connected to a switch, as it can cause temporary loops. It should only be used on ports connected to end hosts or maybe a router. And keep in mind, you can also configure port fast on a trunk port with spanning tree port fast trunk. This can be useful for a router on a stick or when connecting to a virtualization server with VMs in different VLANs. And that's all for this video about port fast. I hope it was helpful. Thanks for watching. Before finishing this video, let me thank my JCNP level channel members who support me through YouTube channel membership. To become a member, please click Richie's Bauman, Christos Cuevos, Diego Bical Espano, Dr. Goldman, Morales, Gonzalo Nico, DG7, Rohan Surti, Marcasta. Another great way to support the channel is to like the video. I am able to make these videos and release them for free on Henrietta Sauer, Bess, Electronovedia, Raymond Kirby, King Bing, Henrietta Sauer, African.
good. Yeah. Game. Beauty hallelujah. It's you. Dari apoka cari o chigiro na cara genai. No dori. Itu Cek, 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 cek. Bos, belit. Seeker arise and delve into the deepest dungeons. Complete all corner dungeons in order to overcome the savage grind. Okay? You only have one life, fall, and that member is out of control. We overcome the darkest pits and answer and emerge victoriously from the depths. You must build Atwin Frankfurt before reaching level 21. You must kill mutants to the power before reaching 22. Atwin Aruga before reaching level 26. Months before reaching 28. Horizon Prime before reaching 33. Dark Master Gambler. Level 1. With the ads. Yeah. Tiga lima. Kedua. Tiga dua. Sorry. Nilai terus. Kira yang bagus ya. Karena setiap progressingnya ini Terus setiap kita menyelesaikan satu dungeon bakal dapat sebuah item. Nah, itemnya itu bakal dapat item upgrade. Jadi dapat upgrade lah. Jadi kayak untuk progressionnya nggak terlalu lah gitu. Dan XP-nya juga kita bisa dapat 1,5x 1,5 kali lah dari XP di panel kan. Kan spell-spellnya spell TBC kebanyakan ya hands, terus kemarin baru progresif yang kan match bisa jadi healer, terus ini main big armor buat nge-heal biar persenan HP buat temannya lebih banyak. Gue pakai force sampai aja. Dan recommending bisa gue bikin buat itu. Jadi kalau misalkan match ini mau every nearby allies kills the target and 2 more nearby allies for 1 fight. Jadi jika gue ngeklik spell recommending ini, kalau ada DPS yang darahnya full, kan gue udah nge-target tanknya, gue tetap bisa nge-heal ya terbaik allies ke heal ke matching. Dari ini nah Evo kalau di WoW Vanilla kan sekarang menit kan cuma 5 menit, jadi kayak mananya boros, ini juga bentar buat boring aja. Saya perlu di sini belum dungeon buat retail. Ini dimanapun kita bisa buat ngerti dungeon tanpa harus ke instansi langsung. Nah, di situ juga ada guild-guildnya lah, harus kayak belum pernah ke hotel lah. Guild-guildnya dan stick enchantnya kayak hotel dengan beberapa tambahan. Kalau kelasnya di sini gue belum warlock sekarang juga bisa jadi sebelumnya sama berbarengan sama match yang jadi gitu. Plus lumayan di level 4 DF kalau anjing ya belum di habis kalau match beginners nomor grand mana beginner casting ini cek oke jangan itu jadi stuck ya kalau jadi stuck di vanilla ya badannya harus kita growth ngambil Okay.
Hello and welcome to Jeremy's IT Lab. In this video, we are continuing with the STP Toolkit section of our CCNA course. We're going to focus on BPDU guard and BPDU filter, two features that are often used in combination with port fast, which we covered in the previous video. These features determine how a port reacts when receiving BPDUs, and in the case of BPDU filter, whether the port sends BPD, helping to protect and manage your network's STP topology. Let's get started. Here's what we'll cover. We are continuing with the STP Toolkit. The previous video covered port fast, a feature that you should enable on switch ports connected to end hosts, allowing them to communicate over the network right away after connecting. In this video, we'll cover two more. BPDU guard, which automatically disables a port if it receives a BPDU, and BPDU filter, which stops a port from sending BPDUs or processing received BPDUs. As I said before, these features are often used in combination with port fast on ports connected to end hosts. Cisco also expects you to know root guard and loop guard for the CCNA, and we'll cover them in the next video. Before introducing BPDU guard and filter, let's see how a port fast-enabled port handles STP BPDUs. Port fast makes a port start in the forwarding state when it is connected, but it doesn't disable STP on the port. So
Doesn't enable STP.
This switch's G01 port has port fast activated, and it sends BPDUs every 2 seconds, like a regular STP port. The PC, which doesn't run STP, ignores the BPDUs, but G01 keeps sending them. I used show spanning tree interface G01 detail, the same command I showed a few times in the previous video. As highlighted, portfast is enabled on G01, and it has sent 77 BPDUs so far, but received 0 from the PC. Because end hosts don't run STP and send BPDUs, a portfast enabled port shouldn't receive BPDUs. But here's the question: what if it does? Maybe a user brings their own switch to work and connects it to the network. What happens then? Let's see. Instead of a PC, switch 1's G01 is now connected to another switch, switch 2. As you know, when a switch comes online, it assumes it is the root bridge and sends its own BPDUs. So what does switch 1 do upon receiving a BPDU from switch 2? If a portfast enabled port receives an STP BPDU, it will revert to acting like a regular STP port without portfast. Let's say switch 1's priority is 32768 and switch 2's is 4096. Because switch 2 has a lower priority, and therefore a lower bridge ID, switch 2 becomes the root bridge, and switch 1 G01 becomes a root port. So what's the problem here? Let's rewind a bit. Here's a simple LAN of 3 switches. Switch 1 is the root bridge with all designated ports. Switch 2 and switch 3 each have one root port leading towards switch 1, and the link between switch 2 and switch 3 is blocked. Bob from accounting is a user in the office. Now, usually, users don't connect directly to a switch. Instead, there is a wall jack near the user, such as on the wall of their office, if they have their own office. The switch connects to the wall jack, and the user's device does too. This is a pretty standard setup. But let's say Bob is tired of walking to the printer and decides to bring his own printer to work. And maybe the Wi-Fi is slow, so he wants to connect his laptop to the wired network instead of Wi-Fi. But the wall jack in his office only has one port. So what does he do?
Next switch.
Instead of following procedure and creating a support ticket with the IT department, Bob takes things into his own hands. He brings an old switch he had at home to work and connects it to the network. Then he connects his devices to his switch, and they can all access the LAN. Problem solved, right? Well, maybe Bob's problem has been solved, but his switch and switch 3 start exchanging spanning tree BPDUs, and this could impact the network. For example, what if Bob's switch becomes the root bridge? If Bob's switch has a lower STP bridge ID and becomes the root bridge, that can affect the rest of the STP topology. Now, each switch's root port points towards Bob's switch, and the switch 1 switch 2 link is blocked. This is a problem. We don't want a user's switch affecting the STP topology. For example, maybe switch 1 was the root bridge because it's connected to the LAN's router. By making switch 1 the root bridge, we ensure that each other switch has an efficient path to reach switch 1 and therefore the router. But now, switch 2's most efficient path is blocked, and frames from hosts connected to switch 2 have to take the less efficient path through switch 3 instead. This isn't a disaster, but in any case, we don't want unauthorized user devices negatively impacting the network. Let's summarize and then see how BPDU guard solves this problem. Portfast should only only be enabled on ports connected to non-switch devices, like end hosts or routers. And these devices don't send BPDUs. However, a port-fast-enabled port still sends BPDUs and will operate like a regular STP port if it receives BPDUs from a neighbor. So if an end user carelessly connects a switch to a port meant for end hosts, like Bob from accounting, it could affect the STP topology. Shame on you, Bob. Do better. But fortunately, BPDU guard acts as a safeguard against such a situation. Let's see how BPDU guard works. BPDU guard protects the network from unauthorized switches being connected to ports intended for end hosts, such as switch 3's G01 port in this example. BPDU guard can be configured separately from port-fast, but both features are usually used together, because they both enhance STP's functionality on ports intended for end hosts. So what exactly does BPDU guard do?
BPDU guard protects the network. Right? Reside in can be configured separately. Usually the function.
A BPDU guard enabled port continues to send BPDUs, but if it receives a BPDU, it enters the error disabled state.
Mm. We first to it for right we wrote message combine DPD and if each that receive BPD, it will automatically um, and error disable state.
So if Bob connects his switch to the wall jack and it sends a BPDU to switch 3 will error disable its G01 port. In effect, this disables the port. It can no longer send or receive data or BPDUs. This prevents Bob's switch from affecting the STP topology, and Bob's going to be thinking the internet doesn't work and come complaining to the IT department. Mission accomplished. Let's see how to configure BPDU guard. Like PortFast, it can be configured in 2 ways. First, it can be configured per port in interface config mode. The command to do that is spanning tree BPDU guard enable. And here's the output of show spanning tree interface detail for G01. As I highlight here, first, it can be configured per port in interface config mode. The command to do that is spanning tree B. BPDU guard enable. And here's the output of show spanning tree interface detail for G01. As I've highlighted, BPDU guard is enabled. Okay, so you can configure BPDU guard on each individual port, or you can enable it by default from global config mode. The command to do that is spanning tree port fast BPDU guard default. And note that in modern Cisco iOS, you can optionally add the edge keyword when configuring. Either way, the device will automatically add the keyword to the configuration, like we covered in the port fast video. Here's that same show command, showing that BPDU guard is enabled by default. Now, when you enable port fast by default, it's activated on all access ports, but BPDU guard works a bit differently. When you enable BPDU guard by default, it is activated on all port fast enabled ports, not necessarily all access ports. Remember that difference. Points like this can definitely be tested on the CCNA exam. But just like port fast, after enabling BPDU guard by default, you can then disable it on specific ports if you want. The command is spanning tree BPDU guard disable in interface config mode. Okay, that's how you configure BPDU guard. Use whichever method suits you, but make sure you don't enable it on a port that is supposed to be connected to another switch, as that will disable the port. Continuing on from the topic of disabling the port, let's look at how that works. Switch 3's BPDU guard enabled port has received a BPDU from Bob's switch, so it is error disabled. In Switch 3's CLI, you'll see this message appear. Received BPDU on port Gigabit Ethernet 01 with BPDU guard enabled, disabling port. And another similar message. BPDU guard error detected on G01, putting G01 in error disabled state. And then these two messages saying the interface status has changed to down and down. In the output of show interfaces G01, you can see that the interface has been error disabled. Error disable is a Cisco switch feature that disables a port under certain conditions, such as a BPDU guard violation. If a BPDU guard enabled port receives a BPDU, that's a violation, the port is disabled. You will learn a few other examples for the CCNA exam, such as power policing violations, port security violations, and DAI, dynamic ARP inspection violations. But those are topics for later in the course. Let's see BPDU guard in action on a Cisco switch. I've configured port fast and BPDU guard on port 1 on the left of the top switch. Below it is another Cisco switch, so let's connect them. Notice that the link light turns solid amber right after connecting. That means the port has been error disabled due to BPDU guard. It can't send or receive data. Even if I disconnect the cable, the solid amber link light remains on. Normally, the link light turns off when you disconnect the cable, but in this case, it stays on to indicate that the port is error disabled. As we just saw, disconnecting the cable from the switch doesn't solve an error disabled port. So let's see how to re-enable it so the port can be used again. First of all, to re-enable an error disabled port, we should first solve the underlying issue. This is key, because if you re-enable the port without fixing the issue, it will just be error disabled again. In this example, if I re-enable switch 3's G01 port, it will just receive another BPDU from Bob's switch and be disabled again right away. So let's disconnect Bob's switch from the logic. Then reconnect Bob's. Now let's see how to re-enable the error disabled. There are two ways to re-enable a port that is being error disabled. The first is manual, using the shutdown and no shutdown commands to reset the disable. The second is automatic, using a feature called error disabled recovery. Let's see how that works. Air disable recovery is a feature that automatically re-enables air disabled ports after a certain period of time. To view the status of air disable recovery, the switch use show air disable recovery. Here's the output. At the top, there's a list of air disabled reasons and their status. The list is quite long, so I've omitted most of it, but as I've highlighted, BPDU guard is second on the list. And as it says, air disable recovery is disabled by default. So that means that air disabled ports won't automatically recover. You have to enable air disable recovery if you want. As I've highlighted in pink, default recovery timer is 300 seconds or 5 minutes. This means that air disabled ports will be automatically re-enabled after 5 minutes if you enable air disabled recovery. You can modify this interval if you want with air disabled recovery interval and then the interval in seconds. But even if you modify the interval, you still need to enable air disabled recovery for approval. So let's do it. Use air disabled recovery cause and then the cause to enable it for ports disabled by the specific. The cause is the feature that disabled the port. This video, we're talking about BPDU guard, but as I said before, we'll cover a few other causes later in the course. For example, if you look at the top of the air disabled reason list in the output above, the top one is ARP inspection, referring to DAI, dynamic ARP inspection, another CCNA topic. To enable it for BPDU guard, use air disable recovery cause BPDU guard, as I did here. This time, show air disable recovery shows that it is enabled for BPDU guard. And G01 is listed at the bottom of the output, meaning that it will be automatically re-enabled after 296 seconds. When this timer counts down to 0, the interface will be re-enabled. One final point. Even if you use air disable recovery to automatically re-enable disabled ports, you still have to solve the underlying problem, like I said before. In our scenario, if Bob's switch is still connected to G01, right after air disable recovery re-enables the port, it will just be disabled again after receiving a BPDU. Okay, we've covered BPDU guard. Now let's move on to BPDU filter. Before we look at how it works, let's see the problem it solves. A switch port connected to an end host continues sending BPDUs every 2 seconds. And it does this regardless of whether port fast and BPDU guard are enabled. So even though Bob's PC doesn't run spanning tree and simply ignores any BPDU, switch 3 keeps sending BPDUs to Bob's PC once every 2 seconds. If the port doesn't connect to a switch, sending BPDUs is both unnecessary and also undesirable for a couple of reasons. First is that sending BPDUs uses some bandwidth and processing power on the switch, although it's minimal. Not a big deal, but still unnecessary. Second is that BPDUs contain information about the LAN's STP topology, and if maximum security is a concern, you should avoid sending this info to user devices. BPDU filter solves this by preventing a port from sending BPDUs. Let's explore how BPDU filter can a port from sending BPDUs. Let's explore how BPDU filter works. As I just mentioned, it stops a port from sending BPDUs. So if you enable it on switch 3G01, it won't send any more BPDUs to Bob's PC. But unlike BPDU guard, BPDU filter doesn't disable the port if it receives a BPDU. How the switch reacts when it receives a BPDU depends on how you configure BPDU filter. So let's see how to do that. BPDU filter can be enabled in two ways, just like port fast and BPDU guard. It can be configured per port in interface config mode, or by default in global config. However, unlike port fast and BPDU guard, BPDU filter functions differently depending on how you configure it. To configure it on a specific port, use spanning tree BPDU filter enable in interface config mode. With BPDU filter enabled, the port will not send BPDUs. On top of that, the port will ignore any BPDUs it receives. Basically, this disables STP on the port, and for that reason, you should use it with caution, in bold red letters. Port fast enabled on the wrong port can cause temporary layer 2 loops, but BPDU filter enabled, the port will not loop. To configure it on a specific port, use spanning tree BPDU filter enable in interface config mode. With BPDU filter enabled, the port will not send BPDUs. On top of that, the port will ignore any BPDUs it receives. Basically, this disables STP on the port, and for that reason, you should use it with caution, in bold red letters. Port fast enabled on the wrong port can cause temporary layer 2 loops, but BPDU filter enabled on the wrong port can cause permanent layer 2 loops, and is a great way to cause a broadcast storm and bring down the network. STP is a key protocol for preventing loops, so disabling it on a port can be very risky. A better choice is to enable BPDU filter by default in global config mode. The command is spanning tree port fast BPDU filter default. And again, you can optionally use the edge keyword after port fast. Just like when enabling BPDU guard by default, BPDU filter will be activated on all port fast enabled ports. And then you can use spanning tree BPDU filter disable to disable it on specific ports if necessary. When BPDU filter is activated on a port, the port will not send BPDU, just like above. But here's the difference. If the port receives a BPDU, port fast and BPDU filter are disabled, and it operates as a normal STP port. To disable it on specific ports if necessary. When BPDU filter is activated on a port by default, the port will not send BPDUs, just like above. But here's the difference. If the port receives a BPDU, port fast and BPDU filter are disabled, and it operates as a normal STP port. This is the best of both worlds. Under normal circumstances, the port doesn't send BPDUs, but if it receives BPDUs, it is able to react appropriately. It doesn't just ignore them. Before we finish up, let me give you my recommendation and one final note about BPDU guard and BPDU filter. You can enable port fast and BPDU guard however you prefer, either per port or by default. It doesn't affect how they operate. However you configure them, just make sure you enable them on the correct interface. But I recommend that you only enable BPDU filter by default in global config mode, unless you have a very good reason to enable it per port. Disabling STP on a port is risky business. Okay, one final note about BPDU guard and BPDU filter. They can be enabled on the same port at the same time, but the end result depends on how you configure the BPDU filter. If BPDU filter is enabled in global config mode, so it's enabled by default, and the port receives a BPDU, BPDU filter will be disabled, and BPDU guard will be triggered, meaning it will air disable the interface. But what about if BPDU filter is enabled in interface config mode, enabled per port, and the port receives a BPDU? In that case, the BPDU will be ignored, and BPDU guard will not be triggered. Basically, BPDU guard doesn't have any effect in this case. So once again, I think it's better to activate BPDU filter in global config mode, rather than interface config. Okay, here's a one-slide summary of this video. Port fast should only be enabled on ports connected to non-switch devices that don't send BPDU. Usually, you enable it on all ports connected to end hosts like PCs and maybe routers. The port still sends BPDUs and will operate like a regular STP port if it receives BPDUs from a neighbor. This means that if an end user carelessly connects a switch to a port meant for end hosts, like Bob from accounting did in our example, it could affect the STP topology. To prevent this, you should use BPDU guard. BPDU guard protects the network from unauthorized switches being connected to ports intended for end hosts. If a port with BPDU guard receives a BPDU, the port enters the air-disabled state. It can no longer send or receive data. You can enable BPDU guard per port with spanning tree BPDU guard enable, or by default with spanning tree port fast BPDU guard default. The default option enables it on all port fast enabled ports. You can then use spanning tree BPDU guard disable to disable it on specific ports if necessary. Now, if a port has been air disabled by BPDU guard, how can you re-enable it? There are two ways to do so. Manual with shutdown and no shutdown, or automatic with air disable recovery, which automatically re-enables the port after a certain period of time. 5 minutes by default. To enable air disable recovery for BPDU guard, use air disable recovery cause BPDU guard. But whether you want to re-enable ports manually or with air disable recovery, make sure you fix the underlying problem that caused the port to be air disabled. Otherwise, it will just be disabled again. Okay, finally we covered BPDU filter, which prevents a port from sending BPDU. But unlike BPDU guard, it doesn't disable the port if it receives a BPDU. How the port reacts upon receiving a BPDU depends on how you configure the BPDU filter. Like BPDU guard, there are two ways to configure it. You can enable it per port with spanning tree BPDU filter enabled. In this case, the port will ignore any BPDUs it receives, so use it with caution. This basically disables STP on the port. So if you enable it on a port connected to another switch, it could cause a loop. You can also enable BPDU filter by default with spanning tree port fast BPDU filter default, which enables it on all port fast enabled ports. In this case, if the port receives a BPDU, port fast and BPDU filter are disabled, and the port operates as a normal STP port. And you can use spanning tree BPDU filter disable to disable it on specific ports if necessary. Okay, that's all for this video on BPDU guard and filter. I hope it was helpful. Thanks for watching. Before finishing this video,
Status mahasiswa. Semester ini 1,33. Ini udah keluar. Sekarang kontrol shift Sih. Komen apa sih? Pak Winter itu pun seberapa itu? Ya, lihat semester ini nilai. Teh, teh. Teh artinya apa teh? Teh. Jadi aja sih. Perbaiki. Pendek. Salah. Abah kuno. Gak tahu dia pun. Gak tahu dia pun tambah kuno. Terlalu OP aja tambah kuno negara ini. Teknik.
BCS.
Tambah kuno.
Bukannya
Besok juga ke Jakarta malah lu jokiin TA gua. Dan ngomong gak dari kemarin nama Opung. Jokiin juga besok bisa. Sih ya. Iya. Kau ini ping aing. Pikir gak kepikiran. Gak benci. Orang berarti salut. Salut. Itu harus anjing. Saat badang. Oh anjing tuh gede baju. Angin badak. Ya, tolong.
What the dog doing?
Flicker. Hilang. Ikannya hilang. Jam 3 badang. Ya, sejahtera. App-nya dia terang benderang ya. Tuh. Pas si Sensen tadi ada di atas.
This is so hard.
Tolong. Oh dia ngapain itu?
About three other individuals. One of them was a male, the other two, the other two were female. Everybody knows what the rest was test. And furthermore, Susan, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised to learn that all four of them habitually smoke marijuana cigarettes. Reefers.
Smoky joints in the morning. I smoke 2 joints at night. I smoke 2 joints in the afternoon. It makes me feel alright. I smoke 2 joints in time of peace, into a time of war. Smoke 2 joints before I smoke 2 joints, and then I smoke 2 more.
Antara tetap sama lu bego aja. Meeting. Mati dong.
Thanks on Emilia. Smoke cigarettes till the day she died. Hell no. To the best you can. Then one day I met a man, came to me and said, yeah, I will good, I will fine, the first take care of him.
Mas ke atas. Si Jesse.
But I never gonna get it.
Sering banget sih. Ya, habis ini siapapun yang kena. Awas, ada petik ya.
Go to Jones in the morning, but I never gonna make it right.
Refleks itu refleks. Refleks. Ada mana? Gak ada mana? Aduh. Kadang siapapun yang dilihat alien ya.
Down here at the pawn shop. A banner made of stone. Just remember it was first and born.
Mana UTS aja udah kelar. Kenapa nggak dapet tadi? Iya. Tapi berat.
Right down here at the pawn shop.
Itu.
Down here at the pawn shop. What has been told about it is gone. Just remember it was flesh and bone. Just remember it and bone. Down there at the pawn shop. Shop.
Ate masih. Ate. Wah, merendam. Bos. Wah, anjing lah. Ibu konset. Ayah. Nah. Gak ada yang lihat. Ya kalian dong. Gak ketemu kalian udah.
Hey guys, I'm gonna show you a really cool farm
Hey,
spot
what?
I found.
Oh,
This one's gonna be
That's
Smoky Needles over north of the Gateway here in Shimmering Flats. So it's all these turtles grouped up. They're grouped up really tight. So just run in, grab this far one over here, kind of go in counterclockwise motion, picking them up, getting some distance between before I pull them with ice sense. Yeah, they're all up here. Just be careful when you gather them. They do have that ability to stop you. So just save your bullet for that. You can be okay. Yeah, you can gather them all up here. It's a huge food. When you're aiming them down, just be aware. It should take probably like 1 or 2 blizzards, 1.5. With Meteor especially, I kind of look out there and level up the process of closing them. As you can see, the XP is pretty good, and I don't even have the 5% up from well rested. You can get like the 2-hour ones from it. And huge flow. I actually just got skinning, so I leveled it up just for this. Another extra 55 XP per skinning each one. So you can see like the XP is really nice. They spawn back almost immediately.
Mata gue cuma disunsin anjing. Gondrong.
So yeah, you just loot them by the time you're up all the way.
Sahabat gue mau gondrong
I actually just got skinning, so I leveled it up just for this. Another extra 55 XP per skinning each one. So you can see like the XP is really nice. Well, they spawn back almost immediately just because there's so many people leveling here in Shimmering Flats. So yeah, you just loot them by the time you're up all the way. And should be all set here with good they drop is Toolikit. You also get a bunch of that.
Bubar.
I got one too. Posting it all up on the auction house afterwards, and you can see. You get stacking 20 pretty quickly. There's 7 silver each. Stacking 20 each is popping up for gold and 40 silver. And again, you can get like 1 to 2 of these per turtle. So if you're doing it full of like a dozen turtles, you can get, if you're lucky, you can get a stack per full per minute. So I mean, that's like a golden minute, if you do get lucky, these turtles. Great source of income. You can use it as soothing purpose, basically, while leveling. Hey guys, thanks for watching the video. We'll get a lot more Ascension content. If you enjoyed my video, just give me a like and a follow. Appreciate it. Thanks guys.
Siap.
You know what? You know what I think we'll do? I think
Hey guys, I'm going to show you a really cool farming spot that I found. This one's going to be in Funky Needles, over north of the raceway here in Shimmering Flat. So it's all these turtles grouped up. They're grouped up really tight. So just run in, grab this far one over here, kind of go in counterclockwise motion, picking them up.
Yeah.
Before I pull them with ice lamps. Gather them all up here. Just be careful when you do gather them. When they get close, they do have a headbutt ability that stuns you. So just save your blade for that, and you should be okay. Yeah, you can gather them all up here. Huge group.
Sang pasir.
Aiming them down, just be aware. It should take probably 1 or 2 soldiers, 1.5 with Meteor especially. I kind of luck out here and level up.
Ya lu ngapain maju banget? Kalau itu. Ya. Banget. Banget cuy itu orang 2 aja.
I make a song better.
What's up, guys? I'm going to show you how to make a ton of gold really, really fast with absolutely no effort. Completely free. You just have to pay attention. See when all board resets. What all board does is dailies every day. Key dungeons, PvE, right? Testing,
Apa mancing?
profession.
Mainan kencing.
That's the one we're going to focus on. You can all board. You go to your major city, Orgrimmar, Stormwind, and they will have this all board. So you run up to it and you open it up, and what you're going to want to see is professions, and you're going to want to pick the quests, right, that have things.
Tanpa ada yang dikorbankan ini.
So, for example, when this all board resets today,
Tanpa perlu
it's going to
mengorbankan
reset
sesuatu
to
bisa
something we don't know,
berapa.
but I'm going to stand next to it, and the second that reset happens, I'm going to run to the auction house and purchase out the first thing.
Asal bukan umur yang pendek sih.
The call board that let's purchase it. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to sit right here and actually between the call board, so you can just be super quick to pop it open as soon as it resets. Right now, I'm just waiting for it to reset. We got about 1 minute here before it resets. You can tell when the reset hits because of the daily quest timer in the top right of the call board there. Daily quest reset. Right? So it's going to reset here in about 5 seconds. Second it resets, just make sure you re-click on the call board with resetting. You have it up reset. Right now, reset, give it a second to load. Bam, first thing you see, it's silver bar. That's what I noticed. That's going to be the really, really easy buy here. The other stuff, tracking things, stay away from just because then
Ngambek dia, ngambek.
buying these out, right? We got six silver, roughly 7 silver, whatever, it doesn't matter. Whatever these